It's an honor and a privilege to welcome Senator George Mitchell to our microphones and cameras here at the CBS Radio Autorama Live Theater. Senator, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great. You know, your bio is beyond daunting. I was trying to figure out what I could leave out so we could actually do an interview after we started this broadcast. So you've been a U.S. Senator, Senate Majority Leader, a famed peacemaker in Northern Ireland, a Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, investigator into the use of performance-enhancing drugs in Major League Baseball, a judge, the governor of Maine, a soldier, a lawyer, chairman of the Walt Disney Company, and in the interest of time, I'm skipping a score of other titles and accomplishments and going forward to your newest title, Grand Marshal of the New York St. Patrick's Day Parade. I'll use the one Irish phrase that I know, Céad Míle Fáilte, which is 100,000 welcomes.
Well, thank you 100,000 times.
So, Senator, where do you live now?
I live in the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
How did that happen?
When I retired from the Senate, I got married. I wanted to live in Maine, where I was born and raised, and all my family still lives. My wife wanted to live in Manhattan, so we compromised and we live in Manhattan. People ask me about negotiating all the time. I say, I don't know about conflicts, but I can give good advice to husbands. And that is compromise with your wife.
That's the kind of compromise that works.
Yeah.
All right. So there had been so much conflict and controversy surrounding the parade for decades. What moved you, possibly the most prominent Arab American in the United States, to commit to walking up Fifth Avenue at the head of the 255th St. Patrick's Day Parade?
My mother was born in Lebanon and immigrated to the United States as a teenager, ended up in a small town in Maine where she met my father, who was the orphan son of Irish immigrants. Ah. My father was born in Boston, never knew his parents. His mother died, father couldn't care for the kids apparently, so he and his siblings were raised in orphanages in Boston, and after many years there, my father was adopted by an elderly, childless couple from Maine who ended up next-door neighbors to where my mother came to. My father's adoptive parents were not Irish, and he didn't have much of a sense of his heritage. He and my mother had very tough lives. My mother was uneducated. She couldn't read or write. She spent her entire life working the night shift in textile mills. My father left school after the 3rd grade and ended up as a janitor at a local school. So I didn't really have much sense of Irish heritage when President Clinton asked me to go to Northern Ireland after I left the Senate. But I spent many years there, and I go there often. I'll be going there in just a couple of weeks. And in the process, I feel as though I discovered a heritage that I really didn't know about. In effect, I filled a void that I wasn't even aware existed. And I've come to love Ireland, both North and South. I've gotten to know many Irish Americans, and I say jokingly, because I get invited to a lot of these events, in the United States there are more Irish American organizations than there are Irish Americans. So when they asked me to serve as the Grand Marshal of the St. Patrick's Day Parade, I was of course honored, but having lived in New York for a few years, I was aware of the controversy that existed, and so I said to those who invited me that I'd be honored to do it, but I wanted to be assured that the controversy about who could or couldn't march in the parade was fully resolved. And they assured me that it was, that it was open, and the controversy was a matter of the past. So on that basis, I accepted, and I look forward to it very much.
So what's going to be going through your mind as you walk up the Queen of Avenues, as you hear the bagpipes and you see everybody wearing the tam-o'-shanters and the shamrocks? What occurs to you now?
As I said earlier, my father didn't have much sense of his Irish heritage. He knew that he'd been an orphan, that he'd been adopted by an elderly family, and in his life, later when he became an adult, he made contact with some of his siblings. I've since had the chance to travel all over Ireland, to walk the streets where I imagine perhaps his parents or grandparents and my ancestors walked to get to know the people. And so, truthfully, I'll be thinking about my father and how much he may well have appreciated this, even given his difficult circumstances.
You know, the Irish would want to know what county he was from. Do you happen to know that?
No, I don't, except that after I spent so much time in Northern Ireland, became well known there through the peace process, I received many communications, letters, calls about real or possible relatives and so forth. And one fellow sent me a map which traced the place of origin of all Irish families. And according to him, my ancestors came from County Clare in West Ireland, where I have been several times. It's a beautiful place. And so when I go there, I always do indulge in a fantasy that this is where my family comes from, although I don't really know about it. I'll tell you another interesting, cute story. After we got the peace agreement, I was asked to go many places in Northern Ireland, and I received a number of wonderful honors. One of them was the rebuilding of a bridge that had been destroyed in the conflict between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And there were a lot of celebrations, and they named the bridge after me, and I spent a wonderful day there. In the course of it, a couple said to me at an event where I was speaking and answering questions, well, you really should look into your father's ancestry, and they offered their services. They're part of a business in Ireland of genealogy, particularly for wealthy Irish Americans. And the local official who was running the event said to me with a kind of a sly smile, he said, Senator, if you pay them enough money, they'll connect you to Brian Boru. Well, Brian Boru won't mean much to most Americans, but he was a very famous Irish warrior king, roughly analogous to George Washington in the United States. Everybody in Ireland knows who Brian Boru is, and so the theory was, you know, they'll make something up that'll make you look good. So we don't really know the history, but it's nice to imagine that my father would have been proud of my serving as Grand Marshal in this parade.
I can only imagine. Well, you're rightly famed for your work with the Irish that resulted in the Good Friday Agreement. Do you have a standard approach to resolving disputes?
There really isn't any standard approach. Conflicts like Northern Ireland, the Middle East, the Balkans are really unique. Each one is different. While there are surface similarities, often they involve religion, national identity, disputes over territory, but still each is grounded in the particular history of the area and the people involved, and you really have to get into the unique circumstances to devise a unique solution. There are principles in which you approach these things. The first and foremost I found is that it's about them, not about me. I recall saying in Northern Ireland at a particularly difficult time, when this is over, I'm going home. Home for me is the United States. You guys are all going to stay here. And so I'm very conscious of that fact, and I stress that in the negotiations, the discussions, and in the drafting of the agreement that ultimately became the peace agreement. So I think the approach, one, is subordinate your ego, listen. It's tough to listen, actually. People think of it as a common thing, but to actually concentrate and focus on what people are saying, particularly if you don't like them or they're saying disagreeable things, is not easy. So I learned to listen a lot and to pay attention to the judgments, not only of those who agreed with me, but in particular to force myself to listen to those who disagreed with me.
This must have taken tremendous patience, though. I mean, the Irish are not unknown for being able to speak. And I can only imagine how long these meetings went on. And you spent years doing this.
I was there over a span of about 5 years. I've done a lot of dumb things in my life, made a lot of stupid mistakes, but one of the most stupid was on the opening day, having been aware of their history of not talking to each other, not listening to each other. I wanted to impress upon them the importance of actually listening to the other guy. And so I said to them, I'm a product of the U.S. Senate, where there's the rule of unlimited debate. I said, I've listened to 16-hour speeches, 12-hour speeches. I said, I will listen to whatever you guys have to say. I can take anything you throw at me. And I later realized that was a really dumb thing to do, because I sat there for years and years and listened over and over, the same guys saying the same thing over and over again. I thought to myself how dumb I was. But in essence, though, it worked well for me. At the time, I regretted the length of the process, but looking back, it was helpful because I did listen. I was patient. I let everybody have their say. In fact, I said to them on several occasions, you guys may complain about me in a lot of ways, and I'm a human and I make mistakes, but not one of you will ever be able to truthfully say that you didn't get a chance to speak your piece, to make your case, to make your arguments. And they all did, and I think in the end that was very helpful to getting an agreement.
Yeah, in the end, I mean, you couldn't have been more pleased, I'm sure. And then the bridge that was named after you, that's pretty appropriate when you think about being a bridge builder yourself.
Yeah, it's very nice. They call it the Peace Bridge. It was gratifying, I must say. I became very deeply, emotionally, and personally involved in Northern Ireland and in Ireland during the course of my time there. I'm an American, proud of it, always will be. I believe that we are so lucky to be living in this country, what I think, despite its many imperfections, still the most just, the most free, the most open society in history. But I will always have a very large part of my heart and my emotions in Northern Ireland.
You've talked about the imperfections of America here in a general way. Washington gridlock, where does it come from? I mean, I saw an interview with the family of Thomas Tip O'Neill, and one of their theories was that nobody lives in Washington anymore because of jet travel, that they don't get together and have dinner together, they don't play cards, and there's no personal relationship, there's no trust. Is this part of it, or?
I think that's part of it. I think there are many factors, and I'm not a social scientist or an historian, so my judgment isn't worth much more than anybody else's. First, it's always been rough. Politics in the United States has always been a tough business. I recently read an article published by a professor at the University of Maine about the 1800 presidential campaign. The candidates were Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, two icons in our national history, and it was rough what was said about each other. Really tough stuff, that as rough or rougher than what's being said in the current campaign. But it is worse now, I think, for two principal reasons. The first is gerrymandering. That's always occurred. It's named after Elbridge Gerry, who was one of the early colonial leaders. But technology has permitted it to occur in a much more precise way, and the gerrymandering by the Republicans, who were in control in 2010, was the most extreme in history. The one 10 years before by the Democrats was the same, although not as effective because it was technologically not as advanced. And 2020 is going to be worse unless we change it to remove the hyper-partisanship from the redistricting. Now, here's the reason why that's important. In the House of Representatives now, because of this partisan drawing of districts, fewer than 50 or 60 seats are genuinely competitive. The districts are all either completely Democratic or completely Republican, which means that the pivotal moment in American politics as to the House of Representatives is no longer the general election. They could care less about that. It's the primary, the nominating process. And as we all know, we have a dismal level of participation in voting in this country, almost non-existent in the nominating process for the House of Representatives. And so the most extreme elements, rigid, ideological, no compromise on both sides, have a hugely disproportionate role in the nominating process. And it produces Tea Party members of the House is the best example. They're absolutely against compromise. They're not interested in the general public. It's who's going to be involved in the will I be outflanked on the right? That's their biggest concern. And you get this kind of policy. So I think 16 states now have started efforts to reduce the partisanship in redistricting. Iowa and California are in the lead, others are following suit. If that can take hold before 2020, you might have, again, competitive House races. The second factor is money. Our system is being inundated by billions of dollars pouring into the political process with less transparency than we've ever had. The Supreme Court decision in the Citizens United case was one of the worst decisions ever made by any Supreme Court in American history. They said that prior courts were wrong in establishing reasonable restraints on campaign contributions and spending. And the result has been, although they didn't create the problem, it always existed, much worse than it ever has. It's a terrible decision. I challenge anybody listening to this broadcast to try to read it. It's unintelligible. It describes an Alice in Wonderland system that doesn't bear any relationship to the reality of American politics. I think that's got to be reversed. A future Supreme Court, in my judgment, will inevitably say, this court, the current court, was wrong when it reversed the prior court. So let's go back to establishing reasonable restraints. I think if you did those three things, the one you mentioned, more contact, more personal contact between members in Washington, nonpartisan redistricting to the extent that's possible, and reasonable restraints on money. And here's the kicker and the worst part. One of the consequences of the court's decision and other factors, not just the Supreme Court, other factors have resulted in billions going in that's unaccounted for. The defenders of the court's decision were fond of saying, disclosure is all that's necessary. Sunshine is the disinfectant, that's what they said. But the reality now is people are putting billions of dollars in, and nobody knows who it's coming from and who's getting it. I mean, it's corrupting the American system, and I think it's a tragedy. And honestly, the overwhelming majority of members of Congress now that I meet don't like the system. It's demeaning to them to have to participate in it.
But at the same time, there's self-interest there. If a safe district is a safe district, right. And how do you say, gee, I'd sure like to open it up so I could possibly be defeated? And isn't that a cross current that's running against it?
That's a very important cross current, and it's a disincentive for them to do anything about it. But in the end, I think the American people are going to demand it. I think there'll be a scandal of some proportions, and bad things will happen, and then people will say, well, why didn't you do something?
This leads me to another question. I understand that you turned down a Supreme Court nomination.
I did.
And I have to wonder whether or not you regret that.
When I read the Citizens United decision the first time, I really regretted it. I thought, gosh, I wished I'd been there during those arguments and to point out how absurd this decision and the written opinion is. But on balance, no. I made the best decision I could at the time on the circumstances that existed, and I don't believe in looking back on things like that. When President Clinton asked me if he could nominate me to the Supreme Court, I had announced that I was going to retire from the Senate before then. We were locked in a struggle, a huge struggle, to change the healthcare system. We ultimately failed. But I had been working closely prior to that with a dear friend of mine, Senator John Chafee of Rhode Island, a Republican. We got along very well. We worked together on a lot of important issues. And I thought that we could work out a compromise. Chafee wasn't quite as certain that we could, and it turns out he was right, but we were trying very hard. It turned out that I overestimated our chances of getting a compromise agreement, and the effort failed. But look, if I had accepted the president's nomination, I wouldn't be here today, because I wouldn't be the marshal in the parade, because I wouldn't have had the chance to go to Northern Ireland. So life takes funny twists and turns, and I don't believe in looking back.
You know, many young people today are turned off at the prospect of going for elective office because of, all of the money involved and the commitment to really a less lucrative career, if you will, than they could possibly have on Wall Street or somewhere else. Yeah. Are you concerned that the best and the brightest are not going into leadership positions in the government?
I think that's a real problem in American life. We still have many able men and women, of course, who are in public life and who will continue to do so, but undoubtedly there are many who have been deterred by the spectacle of what is going on in our society today. And I think we need the best and the brightest because while we are the dominant power on earth and will be as far into the future as human beings can see, we face many challenges at home and abroad, and we need the best people involved in governance. So I speak a lot at colleges and some at high schools, and I encourage young people to get involved in the process because the truth is, while there are rewards in every form of work, there's dignity in every human being in every form of work. Nothing matches the reward of public service, of seeing that you're doing something that is larger than your own self-interest and that benefits others in your own community, your own state, or even possibly worldwide.
And the people with whom you've been associated over the years, remarkable number of people who are famous and well-known, and you know, you were telling me a story when you asked for a cup of hot water here, which surprised me a little.
Yeah.
But I thought it's a great indicator of things that have happened in your life. And I wondered if you...
Well, I've been very lucky, of course. As I said earlier, my parents had no education. They lived very hard lives, and I was very lucky to get to go to college and to graduate and then go on to be a federal judge and then in the Senate and now. But the story I told is that when I do an interview like this or give a speech, I now drink a cup of very hot water beforehand. And I told the story in the book I recently published, a memoir. One year when President Reagan came up to Capitol Hill to deliver a State of the Union address, I was part of the welcoming committee, a small group of members of the House and Senate who greet the president at the door. You go into a side room and you chit-chat, small talk, until he's called in to give his speech. And we were chatting, a few of us in a kind of a small semicircle around the president. And I said to him, Mr. President, anything I can get for you, anything you need before you go on? He said, well, yeah, could you get me a cup of really hot water? So I got one of the aides there to go and get it, and he was drinking the hot water. And he told us the story of how he began the practice of that. He said that he was friendly with Frank Sinatra. And Frank Sinatra told him that every time that he went out to perform, he drank a cup of hot water because it relaxed his throat and somehow reduced the level of his voice to make it sound more intimate, I guess. And so Reagan said to me, he said, I thought to myself, it's good enough for Frank Sinatra, it's good enough for me. And I said to him, well, if it's good enough for Frank Sinatra and for Ronald Reagan, then it's really good enough for me. And I've been doing it ever since. I don't know if it works, but psychologically it makes me feel better.
Well, so far, so good.
So far, so good.
So you have been quoted famously as saying, I believe there's no such thing as a conflict that can't be ended, that they're created and sustained by human beings. Tell us about that. And you know, recently, New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman has declared the Israeli-Palestinian peace process dead, and others have done the same. Yeah. What's your opinion of that, and do you think that terrible conflict, which has gone on, it seems, seemingly forever, can be resolved?
I spoke those words after my experience in Northern Ireland, and I believe them today. I think that conflict will end at some point in some way. Conflicts have two ways of ending, through war and a complete victory by one side and a complete defeat by the other, or through a negotiated settlement. I believe that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will come to an end. I hope it is through a negotiated settlement for the two states living side by side in peace. I readily acknowledge that 65 years of effort have not produced a good result. 12 presidents, 20 secretaries of state, innumerable envoys like myself, many Arab and Israeli leaders. But I believe it's so much in the interests of both societies. And I think ultimately societies, like individuals, act out of self-interest, that they will come to recognize that their self-interest is advanced by having a two-state solution. About a year before he left office, President George W. Bush traveled to Jerusalem, and he made a very important speech to a group of Israeli and Palestinian leaders. And what he said to them was, basically, I'm paraphrasing now, Israel has a state, a very successful state, but the people of Israel live in constant fear and anxiety and insecurity. And those words are as true today as they were when he spoke them. But, he said, they can't get security until the Palestinians get a state. And the Palestinians ought to have an independent, viable, contiguous state, non-militarized, living side by side in peace with Israelis. But the Palestinians are not going to get a state ever until the people of Israel have reasonable and sustainable security. So President Bush argued to them, it is in your self-interest to enter into an agreement, not an act of charity toward the other. He said that to both sides. Well, he was absolutely right. That was one of the best ways of capturing the reason why there ought to be a two-state solution. And I think that ultimately both sides will agree, although, Rich, the political risks of entering into an agreement are high on both sides. Both societies are divided. In both societies, there are very strong elements who do not want a two-state solution. And they will oppose any political leader who takes that step. But I think ultimately, and I hope soon, it will happen. I know people say, well, it hasn't worked, it'll never work. But as I said in a speech in Jerusalem, the peace agreement in Northern Ireland was reached 800 years after the British domination of Ireland began. Interestingly, and I'll close with this, when I finished that speech in Jerusalem, an elderly man came up to me. The crowd gathered around the stage when I walked off, said, Senator, did you say 800 years? I said, yes, 800 years. He yelled, 800 years? I said, yes. He said, no wonder you settled it, such a recent argument. Only in the Middle East could 800 years be considered a recent argument, which means it's going to be tough to resolve, but I think ultimately the parties will resolve it.
Do you think it'll take a couple of special actors on each side to get this going?
Yes, yes. One of the reasons, of many reasons, there is not an agreement now, is that there is deep mistrust, not just between the two societies, but between the two leaders. I spent many, many hours with both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas. And I have come to the conclusion, this is a personal conclusion, that Prime Minister Netanyahu does not believe that President Abbas has either the political or personal strength to enter into an agreement and to see that it's implemented. And so he thinks that any process will fail because of Abbas. Abbas, on the other hand, believes that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not serious and does not really want a two-state solution. And of course, he cites Netanyahu's against four statements as evidence of that. So he believes that any process will fail because of Netanyahu. Neither of them wants to take the enormous political risk that it would entail within their society to enter a process, make compromises when they don't think it'll work in the end. So there has to be a level of trust between the leaders that this can work and we're going to make it work. That doesn't yet exist. Sooner or later it will. These leaders or others, I believe, will reach that conclusion.
So let's come back to the United States and this year's presidential primary season, which has been an interesting one, I think, to say the least. I'm not sure I want to say anything else. Maybe I should just say to you.
That's an understatement.
Yeah. So the level of conversation on the Republican side has been, a lot of people have been stunned by it, I guess would be fair to say. What goes through your mind have you watched any of these debates? And if you have, what do you think?
I have watched many of them, not all, on both sides, and I, like most Americans, have been both fascinated and horrified by the level of discourse in the debates, particularly on the Republican side, the name-calling, the ridicule, the absence of any discussion of issues. In the many Republican debates that have been held, I can't count how many, there has been more discussion about the size of Donald Trump's hands than there has about the threat of global warming, which is one of the greatest challenges that confronts not just the United States, the people of this country, but people the world over. There hasn't been any discussion. You've got candidates running for president of the United States who deny the existence of global warming, who refuse to accept science. It's as though we were back a couple thousand years ago when most people believed the earth was flat and that the sun orbited around the earth. People believed that for a long time, but ultimately science and reason will prevail. I think hope that's going to be the case in terms of global warming, but it is an absolute indictment of our political process that the candidates engage in discussions about the size of one's hands, whether a guy sweats, and so forth and so on, and completely ignore one of the great challenges facing our society today. And you could get down this list, you could make up your own list of issues and the way it's been conducted. I think in the end, while it is fascinating, let's face it, people turn on the TV wondering, what's he going to say next? And I don't want to miss it. I want to be there to hear it. I think in our country, there's always been a strain of what used to be called know-nothingism and nativism, and that continues to this day. But I think that ultimately both science and reason will prevail. We've overcome huge hurdles in our country before. We've had many problems. We've made many mistakes. We are human. No human being is perfect. No human society is perfect. But I think that the goodness, strength, and I believe optimism of the American people will ultimately prevail.
But the Donald Trump phenomenon, what do you make of it? Is it, and there, people talk about he's channeling the anger of the American people. The people are angry and are frustrated and are looking for some outsider.
Yes, I think that's the case. There's no doubt about it. It's a common event in American history that you have had third-party movements and insurgencies and a lot of angry people. This is a very big country. We now have 320 million people, getting much bigger very rapidly. It is becoming increasingly diverse. In most democratic systems, we'd have 8 or 10 political parties representing more narrow points of view. Our two parties are very broad coalitions that really basically organize once every 4 years of many diverse interests. We've had many third and fourth parties in our country's history, but for the past 160 years, since the Republican Party was created over the issue of slavery, the big parties have been able to co-opt the smaller ones. What we may be seeing now is the first historical event of the smaller party co-opting the larger party. The Tea Party has taken over the Republican Party rather than the reverse. And the policies being expressed, the resentments being expressed, represent what I think is a minority of a minority party in the country. But they are taking over, and they're appealing, for the most part, to the fear and anxiety of people. And that's always existed, particularly in tough economic times, not just here, but all throughout history. I don't have it with me, but I often, when I speak, cite a quote about the loss of traditional values, the loss of faith, and I ask people, who do you think said this? They answer, usually they say, you know, Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson or something. It turned out to have been spoken 500 years before the birth of Christ in ancient Greece, when they were going through a transition from dictatorship to oligarchy to democracy. And people regarded what we think of as democracy, that ordinary citizens have a say in their governments, as a threat to traditional values. Oh, it aroused great anger and great hostility, was a subject of some degree of conflict, just like now. But I think in the end, particularly in this country, where we've been so blessed with freedom and opportunity, I think that the American people will, in the end, do the right thing, and I think, really, we have great days ahead of us.
So let me not neglect the Democratic side. Has the Hillary-Bernie debate been healthy for the Democratic Party, do you think?
I think generally so. It's always good to have different points of view, to have competition. They disagree on some issues, but the reality is if you listen to them, they have to strain to find areas of disagreement. They generally agree on basic objectives. I don't know what's going to happen in the election. As of right now, Secretary Clinton appears to be in a good position to win the Democratic nomination, and Donald Trump appears to be in a good position to win the Republican nomination. I think it'll be a very rough campaign, probably close. The country's pretty divided, but I think in that circumstance, ultimately, Secretary Clinton would be most likely to prevail in the general election.
So let me wind this up with an open-ended question, which is, what haven't I asked you that you wanted to speak about?
You've asked me a lot, and I think you've covered everything. I guess I would repeat myself by saying that I believe in the American dream because I've lived it. My parents had very tough lives. They died penniless, but in their minds they were successful because each of their children graduated from college, and each of us has lived a life that would have been completely beyond the imagination of my parents. And I think one of the great challenges we have now is to make sure that's true into the future. I think that a young boy born today in the circumstances into which I was born many years ago has less chance of upward mobility than I did. And I think that's a great challenge that we have to confront, how to make sure that every single American child has a chance to go as high and as far as talent, willingness to work, willingness to take risks will carry them.
Our most sincere thanks to Senator George Mitchell for taking time out to answer our wide-ranging questions here at the CBS Radio Autorama Live Theater. You can see the Senator on Fifth Avenue on March 17th, the Grand Marshal of the St. Patrick's Day Parade. Thanks for joining us, Senator.
Thanks for having me, Rich.